Hey, everybody, I'm Steve. This is really not a talk about how to build a media empire. It was just kind of a shot across the bow since we're at Condé Nast, and I'll tell you about Bustle. We happen to be in competition a little bit. So there's other pieces to building a media empire. Like I said, I'm Steve Faulkner. I'm at South Pole Steve on Twitter, on the internet, on GitHub, on everywhere. So if you see me, that's me. I did go to the South Pole once, but that's another talk, story for another time. I work for Bustle. I'm director of engineering, responsible for a lot of back-endy things, but we kind of have a very nebulous style over at Bustle. If you're not familiar with Bustle, it's one of the larger women's media publications online in the US. We do, across all our properties, 70 to 80 million uniques a month. So been growing rapidly since I've been there. And we got to start in August 2013 to give you a sense. This talk is kind of broken down into 3 sections. I don't really quite know what to expect from the audience, so I'm going to start with like a little bit of an overview of GraphQL, at least how I see it, maybe from a backend perspective, why it's valuable to me, and then talk about some of the ecosystem stuff I think is important, and lastly talk about what we actually do with it at Bustle and how we got into GraphQL. So GraphQL, the actual language, if you go to the website, this is the first thing you see. It says a query language for your API, which I think is a really good way of describing it. It's not a crazy complicated concept. There's a couple key bits. I'm not going to talk about all the things GraphQL does. I'm going to talk about a few parts. GraphQL has a schema, and it is a typed schema. So you actually create types, and within those types you have properties. You can nest these. You can combine them together, and the idea is you can query your API in a typed way. You query it using a typed query language. Looks something like this. And you get back JSON that is actually the result of what you wanted. So that's like the quick overview of what GraphQL is. If you want more info, happy to answer questions later, or somebody else might give another talk that's more in depth. But that's the quick bit about what GraphQL is. So I'd like to talk about kind of how I got into GraphQL. Go back all the way to 2016. It's like ages in JavaScript years. And this was me about GraphQL. So I'll be the first to admit I was like super anti-GraphQL when people started wanting to do it at Bustle. I was like, no way, this is ridiculous. I don't want any of this crazy stuff. REST is good. I know how to do REST. It's fine. So that was 2016. Fast forward to 2017, several ages later, and now I love GraphQL and I think it's awesome. So I'm a convert. It took me a while to come around on it, and I'm going to kind of talk about why that is the case. I think the biggest reason for me personally, and the kind of stuff I do, kind of be more back-end focused, is the types. I think of APIs as contracts. So even when I have a REST API, I think of it as a contract between the front end and the back end. I want to write good contracts. I don't think REST now is a particularly great language with which to write API contracts. So you can imagine a REST API as something simple like give me a vehicle and you get back that. And you didn't really specify anything about that, and you had to write a bunch of stuff in order to actually get exactly what you want. Whereas GraphQL forces you into that pattern. GraphQL, there's not really a bad way to write a contract in GraphQL. You just kind of have to do it the right way. And I think that's really great. It makes my life easier as a back-end developer. It makes the front-end developers' lives easier because they know exactly what they're going to get. So I think GraphQL is akin to writing a contract like this. Give me a car with 6 seats that is red and has a bike rack and includes bikes with mountain bikes and with the tires, right? This is what I want to go camping with my friends for the weekend. This is the thing I want out of the API. And what that actually looks like in production is, I showed a little GraphQL snippet before, but this is an example from our API. If you try to actually query this, you will get GraphQL, which I'll get into in a second, has this nice little underline thing. It says, hey, you're not allowed to do this. Something's wrong. And you get back something from the API and says, post does not have a user, so you can't make that query. And you can do this before you actually talk to your database or do anything related to the backend. OK, so that's kind of a little bit why I think GraphQL is interesting. But what is it actually? Well, GraphQL is a query language specification. So it is not itself anything actually usable, right? It's a thing that says this is how I should be implemented, but you have to rely on somebody else to provide the implementation. In case that you're not already aware, that happens to be Facebook. This kind of came up with GraphQL. I really love this. When I go to DevOpsy things, I like using this thing, but I've repurposed it for this purpose. So Facebook came up with GraphQL. They had something they base off what they built internally. And here's us over on the other side of the wall of confusion, and we got this thing called GraphQL. I think one thing people maybe not realize is that internally Facebook has a lot of stuff that we don't see publicly around GraphQL. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I didn't know that until I started actually meeting some of these people, and I would say, hey, how do you solve this problem? And they're like, oh, we have a whole team that solves that problem. It's just not open source. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not helpful for me. So with that in mind, I want to talk about the ecosystem and kind of the important bits to us at Bustle and what we see as being kind of critical bits in the ecosystem. Because, like I said, GraphQL is just a query language. You're going to need other things. It's not going to, GraphQL itself is really not going to get you very far. First off, GraphQL.js. So we use this heavily at Bustle. It's the reference implementation of GraphQL. It's what Facebook actually releases and works on. People from Facebook work on it. I don't actually know if they use it internally or not, but it is kind of, like I said, the reference implementation. There's a bunch of other implementations, but they're mostly community maintained and created. This is kind of the gold standard. And we just happen to be writing Node now, so it works out very well for us. Graphical. This is a bit that is kind of included with GraphQL.js a little bit. And essentially what it is a browser-based IDE for GraphQL apps. So if you are familiar with something like Postman, for REST APIs, basically does the same thing, but it gives you all this really awesome, nice stuff, like a history pane and ways to autocomplete queries when you're typing them, seeing the actual schema of all the stuff that can be queried from your database. This was a big moment for me when I started doing GraphQL stuff, because the front-end developers can look at this and kind of do their own stuff, and I don't have to set up meetings and have lots of long talks with them about what the API should or shouldn't do. I make it do the things that it's supposed to do, and then they're able to compose stuff in the way they want. And I think that's really great. So it makes communication among the team much easier. It solves a people problem, not necessarily a code problem. Other stuff in the ecosystem. So data loader. I think data loader does not get enough hype. It is open source. It's also open source by Facebook. It's on GitHub. I think it's only about 300 lines of code, so super easy to read and understand. And it does one really simple thing that you're going to want to do. It takes code that you may have written that looks like this. I'm going to load a bunch of things from the database and turns it into something like this. I'm going to make one call and load it all to the database. There's implementations, a lot of different languages. Again, JavaScript, the one relies on process.nextTick to kind of like shuffle all the promises into an array that gets resolved on the next event loop. It is something you were just going to want with GraphQL. So data loader is, GraphQL has this kind of asynchronous resolving, at least in the JavaScript implementation. And you'll find very quickly that will make very inefficient queries to the backend unless you have something like data loader. So when somebody, I'll meet somebody and they'll say, well, I just started using GraphQL and I made this really terrible query. And I'm like, oh, here you go, data loader, like link, this is what you need. Other stuff, this is kind of getting an order from provided by Facebook, first class support kind of on down. Relay is also provided by Facebook. GraphQL, you can do a lot of different things in how you structure your app, how you structure your schema. And it turns out there's a bunch of stuff you're probably going to want to do that Facebook's already done and figured out the best, well, we'll say best-ish way to do it. This was a painful lesson for us at Bustle. We started kind of doing our own way of things, and we said, we don't need that relay thing. We don't need Facebook. And then, fast forward a few months, and we're like, oh, crap, we need to actually solve that same problem. And it turns out Facebook kind of has some of it figured out. So what Relay actually provides is some standards around pagination, how to paginate through a connection in GraphQL. So if I say connection in GraphQL, I didn't talk about that at all, then we'll have to have another conversation later. But ways for the client to actually keep track of the things it's executing against the backend, fetching data that the client doesn't fully have yet. If it has a partial object, how do I get the rest of this object? Just general things about how mutations work in GraphQL, which is GraphQL's way of writing stuff to the backend. I'm not saying you have to use Relay. I'm saying that we learned really quickly that we thought it was actually a really good idea. Relay itself is actually a spec, just like GraphQL is a spec, and then there's a reference implementation as well as a client-side thing that you need to kind of communicate with it. So now we start getting into the hairy bits. Authentication, authorization. GraphQL has no opinion on this whatsoever. And this is always a big problem. It's something we've tried to struggle with a bunch of Bustle to figure out how we're going to do this. I kind of bucket this problem into 3 separate buckets. The first one is just, can I make any query against this GraphQL endpoint? This one is probably the easiest because you are already doing this stuff. You have to authenticate an HTTP request. There's really tons of different ways to do that. This is just a small sampling, and this happens kind of outside of the scope of GraphQL. The next one is, can I make this specific query? So I've sent a query. Is this query something that I can actually have permissions to look at? And you want to be able to figure out this level because the typed nature of GraphQL means that you can statically analyze the queries. And you can look at one and say, I don't even need to execute this to know if somebody should be able to make this query or not. The way we do this at Bustle, and there's currently kind of a lot of debate in the community about the way to do this, but the way we do this is within GraphQL, we have one function that we've kind of duck typed in order to wrap all of our resolvers, everything that resolves the entire query, into an auth system, right? And so we actually extend the GraphQL.js implementation. We add an auth field to every field in that implementation, and that allows us to execute an authorization function before we actually execute the field resolver. It works okay. It has sometimes bit us a little bit. My understanding is Facebook does not do this. They actually do all of their auth below the GraphQL level. I can't say if that's better or worse, but I don't know. I'm happy with how things have turned out doing this. Third bucket is, can I actually view the data that came back? So maybe statically you can't figure out the underlying data may have some special property that, well, I shouldn't show the user this data. The way we do that is just we throw errors. So there's not a better way that I can come up with to do that. And really, our app uses all three of these things. So we use different things in different places where it makes sense. Another thing that everybody kind of, a lot of people recognize right away with GraphQL is query complexity. So this is another thing that comes up as how do we solve this problem. And let me explain it a little bit more if you're not familiar. Imagine you have a simple schema that is composed of posts that have users and they all have comments. And you make a GraphQL API that allows you to do something like this. I want all the posts and all their comments and all the users for those comments and all the posts for those users and all the way down, right? So like live look at this query actually running on the server. This is another thing Facebook says, sorry, right? And this is another thing I also understand them to have an entire team of people devoted to solving this problem, but we just kind of don't get the open source bit of that. So again, kind of three buckets, different ways you can do this, and they kind of parallel the authorization, which is either outside of GraphQL at the static level or at the dynamic level. You can do timeouts, which is something we're starting to do at Bustle. You can do field counts. So this is how GitHub does it. You can only request a certain number of fields out of a query. So that's something statically that you can analyze. And then lastly, this is more applicable to us at Bustle, but we actually keep track of how many database calls you make. So if, say, you're limited to 500 database calls, we hit that number anywhere in the query while it's executing, and it'll just throw an error and say, hey, sorry, I'm bailing because I can't do anything more. Again, kind of three buckets. I'm not convinced any individual way is like the one true way. I think you have to figure out your app and probably use a combination of all three. So lastly, before I move on, I just kind of want to give a warning about monoculture. Something that I worry a lot about is like, do we get too tied to one one company's way of doing things? And so if you're using React already and then you're looking at something like GraphQL and then you're adding in Relay and all these other things, you get stuck in some ecosystem and you're not able to really get out. I think it's really important to think hard about are Facebook's problems your problems, and should we be looking at things the same way? In our case, I can say that I think that's true, at least when it comes to the GraphQL side of things. So you can read what they have to say, what their problems are. They'll tell you. The data loader API, the data loader GitHub repo actually has a really great README that explains why data loader exists in the first place. And this is the key quote kind of from the first paragraph. It basically says why they wrote GraphQL at all in the first place and why they have data loader. It says they need to coalesce the sundry key value store backend APIs which existed at the time. This is like 2010. We had that problem at Bustle. We had a bunch of different legacy APIs. We had a bunch of different legacy databases. We had to figure out how to roll them up into one place. So for us, the answer was, hey, Facebook's problems look a lot like our problems, but maybe you don't have this problem. So if you don't, then maybe GraphQL isn't the right solution. So GraphQL at Bustle. I'm just going to talk through like our architecture and kind of how we got to GraphQL and how it works. I'm not going to go into a super long detail because this talk is only 20 minutes, but starts off with kind of back in the day, Bustle's original API was all a big REST API built on Rails. Then we started writing more REST APIs on AWS Lambda. There's a whole other talk I do all about how we moved over to serverless at the same time, so that was its own adventure. We then started using GraphQL on Lambda and running GraphQL queries on Lambda kind of a little bit after we started doing the REST APIs on Lambda. And then Bustle bought a company. And this was, it still is a big adventure. We're going to hopefully have them fully integrated with our system in the next month. We will. We will. And so this has been a big journey for us figuring out how do we do this, right? I've never been involved in the buying of a company before, so we have to get all of their stuff into our system. The idea is, we got to sell ads across all the properties, and that's the plan. So, oops. This brings the other part in, which is third-party stuff. This is stuff that was just given to us, and we don't really have a ton of control over what it is or how it works. We have to maintain it, but we're not looking to change it. So just I'll do a little emoji reactions to the different parts of our stack that still kind of exist, right? So we have the really, really old stuff that it's like, all right, we don't talk about that. We have the REST API, which this was cool because it was on Lambda, and we did some cool stuff there, and it was kind of our first node in production stuff. But there were some bits that didn't work necessarily so well, because about this time we discovered GraphQL. So we start using GraphQL. We start getting that into production. But that was kind of led by one single person, and as a result, we had to get buy-in from the rest of the team. We had to figure out how we're going to integrate it with all these things, and so it was a little backwards, right? There was some stuff that we kind of did wrong or didn't do the way we maybe had wanted to. It also was written in pure script, which was a little bit of a difficult bit for a lot of the team, seeing as nobody else on the team knew pure script. So we got to this point, and we were kind of like, all right, well, what do we do? And then the last bit, which is the third-party stuff, which we have to make money, so that we have to keep that data around. So now, this is kind of a lot of the focus on Bustle in probably the last 6 to 9 months has been on this layer, right? The GraphQL layer in front of everything else. And that's what a huge chunk of the team has been working on. And so we're happy to say that, we're not quite all into production there, but we are very, very close, and we're very, very happy. Majority of calls go through this first layer to get to all these backend layers. And we're starting to be able to turn some of those old things off, which has been amazing. Yeah, we did. We actually turned off the sad part here. This got turned off last week by Tristan. So really quick, just talk about kind of the 3 approaches that we took towards making that migration. Again, it kind of comes into 3 separate buckets. Number 1, we just built new APIs, new stuff. We just said, hey, this is on GraphQL. It's done. Don't worry about it. That's what we're doing now. We started wrapping legacy APIs, which is kind of what I talked about with the our older stuff. We actually do have places still where we have GraphQL call GraphQL in order to get our legacy GraphQL API, which is weird to say. Strategies here that we've used to success kind of in order of difficulty, reading through to old APIs, copying into new systems and new databases on either read or write, dual writes where we're just talking directly to the database, we're not going through HTTP anymore, and lastly just replacing it outright, which is hopefully the end goal of all this. And the last bit that I think I really want to touch on is really important is at some point you still have Crufty data, right? All of these things won't solve your data Cruft issues. And this is where GraphQL has really kind of been a standout for us. And we started actually writing mutations that allow us to import data into our new systems. So the Elite Daily import, this is an example of something that actually lives in our app where we have the ability to take data from old systems, import it with GraphQL, and the typed nature of GraphQL makes that really awesome because you can't get Crufty data in there, right? It's going to reject it and say, hey, you didn't provide the right data. So this is my little graph for runtime types dominating Crufty legacy data. So this has been a kind of a thing that I don't think I anticipated GraphQL would be really awesome at, but it's been really awesome for us doing that. OK, that's it. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Back when you were talking about the authorization, and you showed where you map over the resolvers and you have that custom function.
Yeah.
What is it doing? Is it just essentially wrapping the resolver, adding the auth check?
Yeah. So to get a little bit deep into it, what we actually add is every, in GraphQL.js, we add an auth key or an auth property to every field object. And that's not part of the spec. That's not part of it. And we look for that when we wrap. And so that thing can essentially be a really simple just list of permissions that we check against. And it also can be a custom function that gets run before the actual resolver gets run. So that's how we do it. I don't know. Yay? Nay? I think it works pretty well. Yeah. Yeah. The team says yay. So.
Cool.
Yeah, solving how we were going to do that bit was a little tough. Like I said, my understanding is Facebook doesn't really do that. They just pass like kind of the current user, the viewer object down into their data layer, and all their GraphQL APIs are very thin wrappers around like kind of a model layer that they have. We do a little bit less of that. It's all kind of muxed into one thing. We'll see how that turns out.
Tell more about how you wrap legacy APIs with, like the REST APIs with your.
Yeah.
You just call out to the flow HTTP.
Yeah, we just make HTTP calls to the backend. We had a few things that we just really could never turn off because other things were depending on them or other third-party systems outside of Bustle, and so it was just easier for us to wrap the APIs, make HTTP calls. A lot of those calls are write operations, which for us are not. They can be a little bit slow, and it's fine, right? Everybody will get over it. So that's kind of why we do that stuff. We have to wrap a couple things related to the pure script GraphQL implementation as well because that was just easier than actually rewriting it. So.
Did you write the wrapper in Node as well? Or?
Yeah. So all of our GraphQL code is in Node now.
When you wrap the backend services, was there ever a scenario in which you would trigger cascading RESTful calls at the backend?
Yeah, we do have some of that now, right? We'll have something like where a front-end call will trigger one or more RESTful calls to a legacy API that will then trigger calls to some other API or trigger calls to things to like index into Elasticsearch. You know, Amazon has a product called AWS X-Ray that we've just recently been kind of leaning on for solving some of those issues. Definitely there are painful points with that, right? You know, at some point you just kind of have to decide, well, do I really care about what happened with this legacy API, or am I just going to like treat it as, you know, kind of this black box and not care what the response was? And that really depends on your app. We have places where we can do that, and we have places where we can't. So, but it's much easier if you can just, you know, send data downstream and not really worry about it if it actually got there most of the time. So architect that way, and then it's fine.
I have a question. So when you're designing your server, do you try to design it so then like each endpoint only corresponds to like a certain resource, or do you still try to design the endpoints like the pure server endpoint, not like GraphQL endpoints, to consolidate multiple resources, or do you try to design it to be?
And we just don't really do that anymore because of GraphQL. We have all of our stuff go directly, you know, through one endpoint, right? And we're just moving everything in that direction. So GraphQL doesn't. We're not building new APIs that are called by GraphQL, right? GraphQL is our API. It's calling legacy stuff, and in cases where we might call like a backend microservices type architecture, we just don't really do a lot of that. We actually have code to talk to the APIs or the databases directly.
Oh, okay.
So. And no other questions?
All right. Awesome.
Thank you.